Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a war that most textbooks barely mention, but whose ripples still shape Asia's balance of power, the Sino-Vietnamese War. Now let me ask you, how does a war between two communist neighbors, both shaped by anti-colonial struggle and revolutionary zeal, explode into open conflict within just a few decades? What changed? And more importantly, what didn't? To answer that, we've got to win back to the 1950s, where the seeds of distrust were quietly being planted beneath the surface of shared ideology. At first glance, China and Vietnam appeared united. Both had adopted communist regimes and had fought brutal wars against imperial powers. But after Vietnam's division in 1954, their paths started to diverge. And once Vietnam reunified in 1975, that divergence turned into something deeper, something irreconcilable. China wanted to position itself as the elder revolutionary brother, the ideological center of Asian communism. But Vietnam had different plans. Rather than falling in line with Beijing's orbit, Hanoi turned toward Moscow, forging closer military and economic ties with the Soviet Union. That move didn't just irritate China, it threatened its influence in the entire region. What was once an alliance started to feel like a betrayal. This growing split formed what some historians call the Sino-Soviet Vietnamese triangle, a tense, unstable configuration where each nation pulled in different directions. By the late 1970s, Beijing viewed Vietnam not just as an ally gone rogue, but as a proxy of Soviet power encroaching on China's southern flank. And then came the Cambodian crisis. In 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia to oust the Khmer Rouge, a regime infamous for its genocidal rule. To the outside world, it looked like a necessary intervention. But to China, it was a slap in the face. The Khmer Rouge, horrific as they were, had been backed by Beijing. Vietnam's military action effectively dismantled China's ideological and strategic investment in the region. So what we have here isn't just ideological friction, it's the clash of national ambitions, security fears, and the collapse of trust between neighbors who once fought side by side. And that's when things start to get dangerous. So, with tensions already simmering, let's talk about the spark that lit the fuse, China's decision to invade Vietnam in early 1979. Now, to understand this move, we have to get into Beijing's mindset. On the surface, it looked like a bold, punitive strike. But beneath that, it was a risky gamble, a series of strategic bets that didn't exactly pay off. First, there was what you might call punitive retaliation. After Vietnam overthrew the Khmer Rouge and occupied Cambodia, China publicly declared it was time to, quote, teach Vietnam a lesson. Sounds dramatic, right? But what they really meant was, you don't get to reshape Southeast Asia without consequences. China saw itself as defending regional order, or at least, its own version of it. Then, there was the geopolitical chessboard. China was deeply anxious about Soviet encirclement. With Vietnam growing ever closer to Moscow, Beijing feared it was being squeezed. So this war wasn't just about Cambodia, it was about drawing a line. It was China's way of saying, we're still a force to be reckoned with. Don't surround us. Don't underestimate us. But here's where it gets interesting. China also saw this conflict as a kind of military stress test. The People's Liberation Army hadn't fought a major war since the Korean conflict in the early 1950s. That's almost 3 decades of peacetime bureaucracy, internal purges, and logistical stagnation. So, when the decision was made to cross into Vietnam, part of the motivation was to see if the PLA still had teeth. But as we'll see, this test didn't go exactly as planned. Strategic miscalculations, underestimated resistance, and flawed assumptions would soon turn this short war into a long embarrassment. The stage was set. China had made its move. But Vietnam? Vietnam was ready. When Chinese forces rolled into northern Vietnam in February 1979, they expected a swift operation, a show of force, a slap on the wrist. What they got instead was a wall of resistance. Vietnam was battle-hardened. Just think about what this country had endured in the previous decades: French colonialism, American carpet bombing, a civil war that stretched across generations. By the time China launched its invasion, Vietnamese troops had become some of the most experienced fighters on Earth. These were combat-ready forces, veterans of both guerrilla warfare and large-scale conventional battles. They knew how to fight in cities, in jungles, in rice paddies, and in mountain passes. They knew how to survive, and how to make their enemies bleed. And the terrain? That was home turf. Northern Vietnam's rugged, forested borderlands gave Vietnamese forces a natural edge. They used local militias and self-defense units that understood every path, every stream, every bottleneck. This wasn't some foreign battlefield. They were fighting for their soil, their homes, their sovereignty. It's the classic underdog advantage, a smaller force fighting with superior knowledge, cohesion, and moral clarity. But it wasn't just tactics and terrain. It was unity. After their victory in Cambodia, the Vietnamese government had momentum, and more importantly, it had legitimacy. The public saw the war not just as an invasion, but as another chapter in the long struggle against foreign domination. That patriotic resolve translated into a powerful sense of national cohesion. Civilians supported the war effort. Morale was high. Every village became a watchtower, every road a potential ambush site. So while the Chinese hoped for a quick strike, they got entangled in a storm of resistance. Vietnam wasn't just defending territory, it was defending its revolution, its independence, its identity, and that made all the difference. So, how long did the fighting actually last? 27 days. That's it. Less than a month after the initial invasion, China declared its mission accomplished and withdrew its forces from northern Vietnam. But don't let the short timeline fool you. This was no surgical strike. It was costly, brutal, and far from the strategic victory China had hoped for. Yes, they withdrew quickly, but they did so after suffering tens of thousands of casualties, far more than they expected. The People's Liberation Army ran into stiff resistance, logistical nightmares, and a battlefield that was anything but cooperative. Roads were sabotaged. Supplies ran thin. Vietnamese counterattacks were relentless. China may have claimed success in punishing Vietnam, but the cost of that message? It was steep, and it didn't end when the last soldier crossed back over the border, because the shadows of this war stretched far into the 1980s. Border clashes didn't stop with the withdrawal. In fact, sporadic skirmishes and artillery duels flared up along the China-Vietnam frontier for years afterward. The war had opened a wound, and that wound kept bleeding. And then there were the geopolitical consequences. This conflict triggered a regional realignment. Vietnam, already tilted toward the Soviet Union, doubled down on that alliance. China, stung by Soviet support for Vietnam, moved closer to the United States, a strange twist, given that the US had been China's enemy barely a decade earlier. In other words, this tiny war helped reshape Cold War fault lines in Asia. So while the guns may have gone silent after 27 days, the aftershocks of this conflict, militarily, diplomatically, ideologically, would be felt for years to come. This was not just a war between two neighbors. It was a pivot point in a much bigger game, and like all great turning points, it exposed deeper cracks in the systems beneath it. Let's pause for a second and zoom out, because behind the battlefield tactics and diplomatic posturing, there's a deeper story, a story about systems, about how decisions get made, and more importantly, about what happens when they can't be questioned. You see, at the heart of this war was a tragic miscalculation. But that miscalculation didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a political system where dissent was dangerous, feedback loops were broken, and ideology often overpowered reality. Let's start with China. By the late 1970s, the Chinese Communist Party was still emerging from the shadow of the Cultural Revolution, a period of extreme political purges, rigid orthodoxy, and institutional trauma. The result? A military command structure that was bloated, outdated, and deeply centralized. Orders came from the top, critical thinking from below, not encouraged. So when top leaders decided to launch the invasion, very few people within the system had the power, or the courage, to push back. There were no checks, no competing perspectives, no open debate about whether war with Vietnam made any strategic sense. And in Vietnam, it wasn't so different. Their system, too, was top-heavy. Decisions were made by a small circle of leaders, often through the lens of ideological purity. When both sides speak in absolutes, compromise becomes impossible, misunderstandings become inevitable, and small disputes spiral into full-blown conflict. But here's the key issue: incentives. In a centralized system, officials often act in ways that protect their status, not in ways that generate accurate information or good outcomes. Military commanders overstate readiness. Intelligence is shaped to fit the preferred narrative. Leaders hear what they want to hear. And that's how bad decisions happen. Not because people are evil, but because the structure rewards obedience over insight, appearances over truth, conformity over correction. So while the world watched two communist nations go to war, what we were really seeing was a breakdown in institutional adaptability. This wasn't just a military clash. It was a systemic failure. Wars don't exist in isolation. They send shockwaves, rippling outward, reshaping alliances, economies, and worldviews. And the Sino-Vietnamese War? It was no exception. Let's start with China and the United States. Now this might sound strange, but this war actually brought them closer together. After all, both countries had an interest in checking Soviet expansion. China's clash with Vietnam, a Soviet-aligned state, signaled to Washington that Beijing could be a strategic counterweight to Moscow in Asia. Just a few years earlier, the idea of US-China cooperation would have seemed unthinkable. But this conflict helped accelerate a new phase of realpolitik, one where former enemies found common ground in opposing a shared rival. And what about Vietnam? They didn't walk away unscathed. Yes, They held their ground against China, but that resilience came at a cost: isolation. Vietnam had now alienated not just China, but much of the non-Soviet communist world. So what did they do? They leaned even harder into the Soviet Union's embrace. More aid, more military cooperation, more dependency. In other words, this war deepened the Cold War's divide. But the most profound impact might have been inside China itself, because after this war, something changed. The leadership realized just how outdated and ineffective the People's Liberation Army had become. They saw the cracks in their own machinery, and that recognition, it sparked a massive push to modernize the Chinese military. New doctrine, new technology, new training systems. In hindsight, you could argue that this war, however costly and inconclusive, became a catalyst for China's long-term military evolution, a wake-up call wrapped in the language of punishment. So let's be clear, even short wars leave deep footprints. This one reshaped alliances, triggered military reforms, and redrew the diplomatic map of Asia. The guns may have gone quiet, but the world after 1979? It wasn't the same. Let's be honest, most people have never even heard of the Sino-Vietnamese War. It's a footnote in the Cold War, a blip on the timeline. But just because it's forgotten, doesn't mean it's irrelevant. In fact, the very fact that it's been forgotten might be the most dangerous part. Because buried in this brief conflict are timeless lessons. Lessons about how power works, how systems break, and how everyday people always pay the price when those systems go unchecked. This war wasn't the result of spontaneous hatred or cultural conflict. It wasn't driven by ancient grudges or irrational passions. It was built, methodically, by central planning, opaque decision-making, and rigid ideological frameworks. Neither side had meaningful public debate, neither had mechanisms for internal correction, and both were trapped in top-down systems that made it almost impossible to course-correct without a crisis. And so, as soldiers marched and bombs fell, the people who suffered the most weren't generals or party officials. They were civilians, farmers in border towns, mothers separated from their children, refugees fleeing through mountain passes. These are the invisible casualties of state-level miscalculation. And here's where it gets real, because even today, across the globe, we still see systems built on central control, secrecy, and ideological conformity. We still see decisions made in echo chambers, far from the scrutiny of the people they affect. We still see wars justified with slogans, but fought with bodies. So what if, just what if, there's a better way? What if decentralization, transparency, and voluntary cooperation offer more than just good governance? What if they offer peace? The lesson of 1979 isn't just about China and Vietnam. It's about the cost of control. So here we are, at the end of a short war with long consequences. The Sino-Vietnamese War wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of systems, of control versus autonomy, of top-down authority versus local resilience. And the scars it left remind us that when power is concentrated and dissent is silenced, the outcomes are rarely wise or humane. There's a hard truth we have to face: unchecked state power tends to multiply its own mistakes. It creates incentives to act boldly, but not necessarily wisely. And once those mistakes are made, it's the people, ordinary citizens, who absorb the consequences. But history also gives us hope, because just as centralized systems create conflict, decentralized ones often foster peace. When decisions are made closer to the people they affect, when trade replaces conquest, and when ideas are allowed to compete freely, human flourishing tends to follow. The story of 1979 is more than a regional footnote. It's a warning, but it's also a signpost, a signal pointing toward the kind of world we could build if we learn to value cooperation over coercion and dialogue over domination. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more people discover the stories that textbooks leave behind. You can also listen to the podcast version of this episode using the link in the description. And if you want to explore more forgotten wars, twisted alliances, and the economic and political systems that shape them, check out the other videos on this channel. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep digging for the truth behind history.